You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 153 of the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I'm the host of the Just Japan podcast, a weekly show that brings to you all kinds of Japanese goodness. That's right, good things from Japan. And this week, yet again, another wonderful episode. Hey, guys, you awesome folks out there listening, you're the ones I make this show for, and we're coming off a banner month. The month of March 2017 was a record month for the Just Japan podcast. More downloads than ever before, which means more people, more awesome folks like you out there are listening. And for all of the new noobs, all you new folks out there listening, thank you so much for subscribing to the Just Japan podcast. Trying out the show that's all about Japan. All right, so I'm a Canadian. I live in Kobe, Japan. Been here for a few years. That's right. And each and every week I bring on a different person to share with you a different aspect of life in Japan, different hobbies, different forms of travel, food, drink, you name it. It's all about Japan. And this week, I'm honored. Hey, we've got Mr. Paul Martin of thejapanesesword.com, the Japanese Sword Facebook page, a legitimate expert on Japanese swords, a man who knows his stuff better than most people out there in the world. I'm very honored the fact that, Mr. Paul Martin was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to join us here on the Just Japan podcast to talk about his life, his relationship with swords in Japan, the history of swords in Japan, and, just about such an incredible topic. So, shortly hereafter, not long from now, later on in the episode, you're going to hear Paul Martin talk about Japanese swords. Now, folks, remember the Just Japan podcast is part of the Japan Podcast Network. Go over to japanpodcastnetwork.com to find all kinds of cool podcasts and cool podcast content about Japan. All right, folks, and you know the drill. You can find the Just Japan podcast all over the place. Do a Google search for it. We're on the iTunes, we're on the Libsyn, the SoundCloud, the Stitcher. What you can do to help the show grow is subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and all the awesome people that you know. All right, folks, the new fiscal year has begun in Japan. That's right. At the beginning of April, the new year began, and the new school year will begin soon. So it's a time of change. My daughter started kindergarten. In Japan, we have 3-year kindergarten. My daughter is now 3 years old. In May, she will turn 4, but she had her first day of kindergarten just a few days ago. My son, and folks, those of you who have been following me for a long time, hold on to your seats. This will be hard to believe. He's Ichinensei. That's right. My son starts elementary school on Monday, which will be, oh my goodness, I'm having to very professionally pick up a calendar from my desk, leaf through the calendar, because I don't know when that will be. January, February, March, April. Oh my goodness. Oh, April the 10th. April the 10th. Monday, April the 10th. My son will be a first grader. He's got his Randosel backpack. He will be carrying that to the local Shogaku, the local elementary school. It's an exciting time in our house. So busy things happen, and I'm busy too as the new school year approaches here in Japan. Busy as a bee. Back at work again a few days ago. Those of you who follow me on my social media on the Just Japan Stuff Facebook page and on Twitter and all of that stuff will notice, hey, Kevin was like fire hosing us with information, content about Japan, links and news links and opinions and jokes and silliness. But all of a sudden, he's not really around so much anymore. Well, that's because I'm back at work. So I will try to get to you when I can, but been pretty busy. Another thing that's been going on has been Hanami season, the cherry blossom season. Been a bit late here in this part of Japan. It was cooler, a little bit cooler and colder than normal during this time of year. So, although here in the Kobe region, the Kansai region, it was forecast that the cherry blossoms would be opening up and blossoming and blooming at the end of March. It's not until April that it's happening. It's actually happening right around now in midweek. And unfortunately, I can't partake in all those picnics and things because I'm working. But this weekend, hopefully, if the weather permits, I hear it's going to rain. I'll try to get there and enjoy some time under the cherry blossoms with family and friends, with food and beverages. We'll have to see. For those of you who get a chance to get out there and enjoy Hanami here in Japan, lucky you. It's a good time of year. For those of you who are out there in the world, hey, it's a good time of year to get here. So one thing I do want to mention, and this is a cool little thing, I've got to admit that some podcasters that I listen to, that's right, I listen to podcasters. I'm a big fan of Scott Johnson and Brian Ibbott over on the Frog Pants Network. I listen to a lot of their podcasts, and I know that Scott Johnson of the Morning Stream, oh, you can hear an ambulance outside. There you go, Japanese ambulance. That's what it sounds like. They use a new app. It's an Android app, an iPhone app called Anchor. That's right, the thing that you drop from a ship, Anchor. And Anchor is a new way, kind of like a social media kind of audio sharing thing. And I've got my own little show I just started up called Just Japan Bites. So I will try to several times a week, every day if possible. It's really easy to do. I just do it from my phone right into the app and boom, there you go. I'm going to leave little bites about Japan. I've got one episode up there about Hanami. It's about 1.5 2 minutes long. So if you go over to the Anchor app, you download it onto your iPhone device, your Android device, your Apple device, phone device. It's called Anchor. Check out Anchor, the Anchor radio app, and look for Just Japan Bites. By the time this drops on Friday night, April 7th, there should be a couple of little bites up there already. There's one there right now as I record this. So go to the Anchor app, go to the iTunes store, go to the Google store, and check out Anchor, the Anchor app, as an anchor that drops from a boat. And a lot of content creators are sharing some fun media. It's kind of just a brief little unedited slice of life in Japan. So go over and check it out. Just Japan Bites on Anchor. All right, let's jump into the show. I'm very happy this evening, this afternoon, this morning, depends what time you're listening to this podcast, to be joined by Paul Martin, who is a man who knows a lot about Japanese swords. And you can see that when you go to his Facebook page, The Japanese Sword, or thejapanesesword.com. He's going to talk to us about Japanese swords this evening. So let's take it away. All right, folks, welcome to episode number 153 of the Just Japan podcast, The Japanese Sword. And today I've got special guest Paul Martin with us. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, now, Paul, it's our first time on the Just Japan podcast. I was wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and let us know what you do here in Japan.
Yeah, I'm a Japanese sword specialist. And I generally promote traditional Japanese swords around the world. I also produce DVDs and translate and write books, and anything to do with swords, Japanese swords, really.
Oh, great! Now I'm curious, what first got you interested in Japan and in Japanese swords?
Yeah, when I was a child, my father practiced karate.
Okay.
And I was interested in karate, so I wanted to go too. So growing up, I often heard, samurai spirit and bushido and things like this. I mean, at the time as a child, I didn't really know what they meant, but as I grew up, I began to understand.
Okay. And so where I failed to ask you, where are you from?
I'm from London, England.
Okay. So growing up, you had that kind of a bit of Japanese culture around you.
Yeah.
So when did this kind of passion for swords really take off for you? When did you start to really educate yourself about them?
It's kind of hard to say, really, because when I was a teenager, I was watching Kurosawa movies, and obviously I thought they were very cool weapons, and the samurai were very heroic and cool. but I saw a movie called The Yakuza when I was about 15, I think, and Robert Mitchum was in it and Takakura Ken. Uh,
Oh.
and there's a big sword fight at the end of the movie, which is very impressive. But there's also some spiritual talk about Japanese swords, and Robert Mitchum was the first white man I'd ever seen speak Japanese, so that was it left quite an impression.
Ah, yes, yeah. Okay, well, okay. For the listeners out there, and for me too, because I really honestly admit I don't know anything about swords, and it's one of the reasons why on this podcast I like to bring on different guests each week, so I get to learn as well with the listeners. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the history of swords in Japan?
Yeah, the steel technology originally came from China and Korea. Around the third century, swords began to be made in Japan, but around that time they were straight swords, and they were based on the Asian swords and the mainland Asian swords. So sword making began to take off between the third and sixth centuries, and then around the mid 10th century, the Japanese put the curve into the sword and made it uniquely Japanese. And since that time, the shape, the curvature has changed over the different historical periods. But also, the Japanese signed and dated the tangs of the swords, which is very important. So you can follow this progression of the shapes and the manufacturing process of the sword.
Hmm. So why were swords, or why did the Japanese add that curve to the sword?
Um, I mean, it's probably practical reasons. A curved sword has less friction than a straight sword. There's less surface area touching the target when it slices through the target. But there was the geometry of the sword changed slightly as well. It has a very acute beveled edge that does the main part of the cutting with a thicker back. But the curvature of the sword changed as well. Originally, in what's called the Kamakura period, around the 12th to 14th centuries, early 14th centuries, there was the curvature was in the base of the sword. The deepest part of the curvature was in the base and the handle of the sword.
Oh, okay.
But when you get to the Muromachi period, where you have the Sengoku Jidai, the 100 years of warfare, the curvature goes into the upper part of the blade. The deepest part of the curvature is in the upper part of the blade. And the reason is that originally they were for horseback use, for cavalry use.
Okay.
And then once you get to the Muromachi period, there's mass infantry warfare. So the curvature goes into the upper part of the blade. And the way that they were worn changed as well, because when they were worn on a horse, they were worn with the cutting edge facing downwards and suspended from the hip. But then once you get to the Muromachi period and these other periods, they become a katana, and they're thrust through the sash with the cutting edge uppermost, and they can be drawn and cut in one swift movement.
I suppose that's kind of when people out there who maybe don't know much about swords, but when we think about Japan and we think about the katana and that kind of the samurai, drawing that sword and swinging it in one motion, that's kind of what we think of.
Right, yeah. But I mean, to be honest, there was other more effective weapons. They had the bow and arrow, and there was lances like spears and halberds for keeping your opponent at distance. And there was even stone like catapults and stone throwing. The sword was only used for kind of self defense and close combat. So they weren't used as much as we think. As people generally think. And they're also very spiritual objects. They're donated to shrines and as offerings, and even as vessels for the gods, the kami, to reside in. And then the sword itself can be revered, in the shrine as the main deity.
Wow.
But in addition to that, they're also art objects. The blade itself is intrinsically beautiful. From the folding of the steel produces a grain pattern in the steel, much like a wood grain pattern, but it's kind of quite subtle. And then the pattern of the hardened edge called the hamon, which is produced by applying clay to make the cutting edge very hard and the back of the blade retain its ductility. There's a transitional line, and this pattern is called a hamon.
Well, so I'm curious. These swords, I mean, a traditional Japanese sword, a katana. These blades, we hear about them, about one of the things that make them so strong is the fact that the metal is folded so often or so much. How long does it take a sword maker to create a weapon like that?
A sword can be produced in a week to 2 weeks, and that's by today's standards.
Okay.
And there's lots of myths surrounding swords and their manufacture. Lots of people think that they're folded thousands or millions of times or a million times, or these kind of things, but they're only folded around 12 to 15 times these days. And back in the Kamakura period, it maybe only been 8 times.
Okay.
Because as you fold the steel, the layers increase exponentially. So one fold, 2 layers, 2 folds, 4 layers, and so on. And once you get to 10 fold, you're up to something like I can't. I'll just off the top of my head, 30,000 layers, something like that.
Wow. So right now in Japan in 2017, are there many artisans left in Japan who are doing this, who are creating swords?
Yeah. Nowadays, since the Second World War, every swordsmith has to be licensed. He has to take a test. He has to study for at least 5 years before he can take the test. And then when he passes the test, he's given a license and a logbook, and he's allowed to make swords. And
Okay.
then every sword that he makes as well has to be licensed individually.
Mm.
Anyone can own a sword in Japan, but every sword has to be licensed.
Oh, okay. Wow. So with with regard to buying swords, owning swords, obviously, Japanese swords are attractive to collectors all around the world.
Yeah,
Um,
no doubt.
yeah, I mean, I've seen on TV that there's like different shows and shows where people come from collectors and buyers come from all around the world who come to Japan to buy swords.
Yeah.
Um, what is it that what do you think is so attractive about Japanese swords to collectors out there?
I think that there's a lot of mystique that surrounds Japanese swords. Like I said, there's lots of kind of legends and stories, and lots of these myths as well. But um, I think this mystique is part of the appeal. But the fact that they're not merely weapons, the fact that they've got a spiritual element and an artistic element, obviously they are a weapon fundamentally, but they have these other aspects to them.
Mm. I suppose you mentioned too. I mean, even as an art piece.
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
Yeah,
I know you've got a video posted on your Facebook page and everyone, by the way, go check out Paul's Facebook page, The Japanese Sword, facebook.com, The Japanese Sword. There'll be links to it in the show notes. You've got a video there introducing, kind of talking about or showing Japanese swords, and just there was I remember in the video on your Facebook page, it's showing the now I apologize for not knowing the terminology. Uh, the handle, no, where you hold the sword,
yeah.
and it was just showing that up close and how beautiful and intricate it was, the pattern, the design, and all of that.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's mostly practical stuff as well, because the white kind of grainy skin on it is actually ray skin, and while it's very wet, it's supple, and they put rice glue around the handle and they wrap it in this ray skin. Then it dries, it becomes very hard and resilient,
Mm,
and so it's very protective. And then it's bound in either silk or leather over the top of that and things. But there's all different combinations you can do.
yeah.
But yeah, the sword itself is a symbol of Japan, just like Mount Fuji and cherry blossoms. But it's also a symbol of Japan in the fact that many different craftsmen have to come together. You have the person who makes a blade, the person who polishes a blade. There might be a blade carver who carves artistic designs into the blade as well. And then you have the handle wrapper, the scabbard maker, the person who lacquers the scabbard. All these different craftsmen have to come together and not let each other down to make this one perfect sword.
Wow.
So it's Japanese ethic of teamwork involved in it as well.
I didn't realize that so many people were involved in putting together a sword.
Yeah. There's about 6 or 7 different craftsmen.
Wow. Are there any places within Japan itself, like any areas that are well known or kind of famous for sword making? Because I know it tends to be like, in Japan, that's kind of how things work. There's like different geographical areas that are famous for certain things.
Right. Well, historically, an area called Bizen, modern day Okayama,
Okay.
was very prolific in sword making. But modern day wise, they kind of spread out over Japan. I expect Seki in Gifu Prefecture is still very predominant in making sword making.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm wondering. I mean, when I look at your Facebook page, and your website, The Japanese Sword, you've got a tagline there dedicated to the preservation and promotion of Japanese swords, swordsmiths, and related crafts. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, what type of work have you done in your career? Do you do towards the preservation and kind of promotion of swords?
Well, as I said earlier, I write books so that people can understand swords, and I translate books, from Japanese. But I'm also a secretary for the Nihonto Bunka Shinko Kyokai, the public foundation for the promotion of Japanese swords, basically. And I'm also a lecturer for Honganji Japanism Academy as a specialist on Japanese swords.
Okay. So I suppose you do a lot of interviews, a lot of discussions on TV and presentations and things like that.
Yes, I do that. Yeah, I appear on TV quite a bit, even in Japan. And I also lecture at the Samurai Museum in Shinjuku in Kabukicho.
Ah,
So, so people can come along and get to handle swords and they get, a presentation first. Yeah, so, I do all different things. I also work as an agent for foreign collectors, or sorry, non-Japanese collectors who want their swords restored in a traditional manner. So they send them to me, or they want them appraised in Japan at the Sword Museum. So they send them to me, and I act as an agent and facilitate all those things for them.
okay. I suppose we talked about this on the phone a few days ago, but actually, everyone out there, I have actually I saw Paul on TV not that long ago. Actually, it was a TV show called "Why Did You Come to Japan?" and that's what it was. They followed some person to a guy who was a buyer to one of these. I'm not sure what you call it, an exhibition or a show where people go to buy swords.
Yeah. It's a sort an annual sword fair that takes place.
Okay, so with a sword fair like that, are you there working, helping kind of match people with swords or introducing them to buyers and sellers?
Yeah. I mean, I work as a finder as well. If somebody's looking for something specific, I will try to find it for them. But I'm mostly just doing what's called aisatsu, just going there and showing my face, and because lots of craftsmen go there as well. There's swordsmiths there, and and I have a relationship with some of the dealers and things, that because, like I said, I find things for people.
Okay.
Okay. And they're very cooperative as well. I mean, when I translate books or I write books, some of the dealers have the best photography, or they have swords. Some of the um, uh, the information that I need. So they're very cooperative like that.
Nice. Okay. Well, I'm curious. Now, I mean, a lot of people who listen to this podcast often ask me, or they say, I want to come to Japan, I want to work in Japan, I want to live in Japan, um, or I'm really interested in Japanese culture, history, whatnot. Do you think you would be able to do this type of work you do if you didn't speak Japanese?
Not to the degree that I do it now. I mean, if you don't speak Japanese, you can own swords and appreciate Japanese swords with a very limited amount of Japanese. Because most of the terminology and the sword inscriptions are all in archaic Japanese anyway.
Okay.
But for what I do, I need a fairly substantial level of Japanese. Reading, writing, and being able to speak.
Mhm. I suppose if you're translating, yeah, obviously your level has to be pretty high. And also if you're communicating with all these artisans and swordsmiths and people like that, you need to do that efficiently.
Yeah, that's right. And any foreigners who have been through an apprenticeship in Japan are pretty much automatically fluent in Japanese because you're spending 6 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day with your teacher.
So obviously, I mean, in order to translate and whatnot, you're going to need a strong command of Japanese. But I assume also just, I mean, I'm someone who lives in Japan. I've been here for quite some time, and my Japanese level is actually very low. So I can only imagine it would, if I were really interested in learning about swords. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff out there, material online. There's a lot of books that are in English. But for me to actually go out and to meet an artisan and try to communicate with them, for someone like me, that would be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, even for Japanese natives who are translators, when they go to a craftsman's workshop, they not necessarily familiar with the terminology. It's
Oh, true.
particularly, so it helps, that you're a specialist in a particular field.
Yeah, I suppose right away when I think about that, I think of an example of one time when I first came to Japan, I went to a dentist who was very excited that he found out I was Canadian because he had studied in Canada, and he started throwing like this medical terminology around in English to me, and then he was like, "Yeah, you know this? Do you know that?" And I was like, "No, I don't," and he was really disappointed. And I said, "Well, I'm not a doctor.
Right? Yeah,
I mean, I know that's English, but I don't know what it means."
I have the same thing.
Yeah.
Often.
Okay, well, I'm curious. Could you tell the people out there a little bit about your Facebook page and your website, The Japanese Sword?
Yeah, my Facebook page it has over 20,000 likes, and it gives information about sword events around the world where people can go and see swords or go and speak to people who know about swords. And I promote different things, and I try to give information about famous swords now and again, and usually promote my own TV clips and stuff like that.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'm curious. Do you have any tips or advice for people out there who are interested in learning more about Japanese swords?
Yeah, I wouldn't rush into buying swords. I would buy books first, study some books, and just don't, because eBay is a kind of dangerous, can be a dangerous place, for stuff like that.
Is that maybe you're not sure really what you're getting?
Right, exactly. And you need, on a very basic level, you need to be able to tell the difference between a Chinese-made replica and a real Japanese sword. And also there's the temptation for people to do their own restoration. They'll buy something in a poor condition and they'll want to restore it themselves, and really they shouldn't, because they don't know what kind of art history or what kind of history they're destroying. And they may be destroying it rather than preserving it.
True enough. True enough. I suppose that's a kind of that's one of those things where people who are interested in preservation and promoting history of lots of different things, where it be buildings or different kinds of antiques and artifacts, when people do like refurbish something, there's always that question: is it the original thing that it once was before?
Right. Yeah. But with swords, because there's different, in the steel you have different activities and different hues and textures in the steel, and these can be slightly altered. If you're doing it wrong. And even the basic shape of the blade. If you change the shape of the blade, it's going to be hard to appraise the blade for when it was made and stuff like this.
Okay. I'm wondering, are there actually, like in places like Tokyo or other parts of Japan, are there workshops where people, the laymen, people who are interested in learning about swords can attend to learn?
Yeah. There's the Samurai Museum in Kabukicho that has regular sword lectures and hands-on chance to appraise a sword, or I say appraise a sword, appreciate a sword, look at it, view it, And there's the Sword Museum in Tokyo, which is going to be moving soon, but it's currently in more near to Hatsudai in Yoyogi, and it's going to be moving to Ryogoku by the end of this year.
Wow. Yeah, no, I would definitely that would be a really interesting place to visit, the Sword Museum or the Samurai Museum.
Yeah, and Tokyo National always has great swords on display, and some armor upstairs as well.
Yeah, I suppose there's a lot of different museums you go to. Even last year I was in Matsue City and I went to Matsue Castle, and they had a lot of great samurai armor and swords on display there.
Yeah. There's quite a lot that goes on. There's always sword exhibitions in Japan.
Nice. Now I'm just curious, as far as collectors go and stuff. What I'm going to assume that if a Japanese sword, I want to buy a sword, and it's a legitimate, real sword from Japan, made in Japan. I'm going to assume that it's not going to start off as a cheap thing. But what would a kind of like a starting price, like, if there was someone out there who was thinking of someday collecting, what kind of money do people,
I mean, I'm just going to translate into US dollars to make it easier.
Sure.
But I mean, as a, basing 100 yen on $1 kind of thing,
Yeah.
Probably about $3,000 at the low end.
Okay. What are some of the kind of on the high end, more extreme high end? What do some of the really special ones go for?
A national treasure recently sold for something like $3,700,000 thereabouts.
Okay. Wow.
But yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot, but when you think about, this was a national treasure. When you as art, it's not very expensive at all. When you compare it to a Rembrandt for $40 million and things like this. I think that Japanese swords are extraordinarily low priced.
Wow, that's very interesting. Very cool. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm curious, how can people connect with you on social media?
Yeah, I have my web page, thejapanesesword.com. I have a contact page on there, and then there's Facebook. I'm on Twitter as well, the Japanese Sword, but I think the O is missing out of sword. Yeah, and that's my three main avenues: Facebook, my webpage, and Twitter.
Great. And I'm going to put links to all of those guys in the show notes at justjapanstuff.com. You go there and you'll be able to link to all of Paul's contact things and go check out his stuff. Go like his Facebook page and follow him on Twitter and check out his sword stuff. Cool. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
No, thank you very much. It was very nice. Thank you.
The number you have dialed has been changed. The new number is... Please note, the new number is...
All right, folks, I want to thank Paul Martin for stopping by the Just Japan podcast. I got to admit, Japanese swords, a topic I know nothing about, but I'm very fascinated about. So thank you, Paul, for taking the time to stop by the podcast and share your knowledge with us and, with myself and the Just Japan podcast listeners. I suggest that all of you out there listening go over to his Facebook page, The Japanese Sword. Go like it. Go follow him on Twitter at The Japanese Sword. That's at The Japanese SWRD. Take out the O, okay? All those links will be in the show notes at justjapanstuff.com. Of course, under episode number 153. And now a word from a new sponsor for the Just Japan podcast. I've been living abroad for years and spend a lot of time ordering things online. There are many things that my family and I want that we simply can't get here in Japan. I often want to order from stores in America, but unfortunately, many of them don't ship internationally. Well, there's a solution. Fish is Fast. When you make a Fish is Fast account, you create a virtual US address. You can order things from a large number of stores in America, and those products will be shipped to your very own Fish is Fast mailbox. Once all of your orders arrive, they consolidate them and send them to you wherever you live in the world. You can use the great Fish is Fast web app, where you can manage all of your incoming and outgoing shipments and review all the details before you decide to ship the items. Fish is Fast can even return the items to the store for you if you want. You save a lot of money by consolidating many orders and having one box shipped to you instead of making multiple shipping payments. You can buy from stores that don't ship internationally, and Fish is Fast will even hold your orders for up to 180 days free while you consolidate different orders. Now, no matter where you live, Fish is Fast can get you the things you need. Go over to fishisfast.com and check out what they have to offer. You won't be disappointed. Also, a big thank you to Fish is Fast for supporting the Just Japan podcast. So I wanted to throw out a big shout out to a friend of the Just Japan podcast, Josh Yates, frequent commenter on the Facebook page. He's been on the podcast before. We got to get him on again. He was on in an early episode, maybe 51 or 52, talking about getting involved in your local community. And he wrote an article for Kansai Scene magazine. Kansai Scene is a kind of English language culture and what's going on history / current events magazine that's available here in the Kansai region of Japan. So like Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe, Himeji, all that stuff. And so he wrote this great piece called Japan in Your Ear. Liven up your daily commute with some fresh English audio podcasts on Japan. And in it, he mentioned the Tofugu podcast, which is a new one that has been out recently, from the guys at tofugu.com, the True Crime Japan podcast, which I got to check out, and the Just Japan podcast. And what did Josh write? He was kind enough to write, he wrote, and this is on page 21 if you have a copy. And if you don't have a copy, you can go to kansaiscene.com and check it out. He wrote, when it comes to podcasts for expats in Kansai, you can't go past Japan's longest running Kobe-based interview show. Host Kevin uses his curiosity as well as his long list of contacts to conduct weekly interviews. Topics ranging from light-hearted reminiscence about good times in Japan, for example, the episode about holidays in Japan, to deeply informative pieces. The episode on teaching in Japanese universities is a must-listen for anyone thinking about taking this route. With over 140 episodes in the bank, that's 153 as of right now, this may be the perfect antidote for your boring train commutes. Check out justjapanstuff.com for the older episodes. That's right. And there'll be a link in the show notes, by the way, in this episode to the Libsyn. iTunes only carries 99 episodes at a time. So for the 54 episodes that aren't on iTunes, you can go to the Libsyn link in the show notes. Do like Just Japan Podcast Libsyn, maybe in your Google search, and you'll find all the episodes are there. But again, hats off to Kansai Scene magazine for helping throw some of you, and if you guys are listening to the Just Japan podcast for the first time because of Kansai Scene magazine, thank you. Welcome to the party. You got a lot of things to listen to in the background. There's 152 other episodes. Josh, thank you so much for writing this article. Got to get you on the podcast soon. Got an idea. Got to get you on soon. And yeah, for new listeners out there, thank you so much for joining the party. And of course, you can read this article over at kansaiscene.com. Link will be in the show notes at Just Japan Stuff. All right, folks, that does it for another episode of the Just Japan podcast. Go over to justjapanstuff.com to check out all kinds of stuff about the podcast and other things about Japan. Of course, the show notes for this week's episode will be there, where you can find all the information, the contact information for Mr. Paul Martin, who was on the podcast this evening. Of course, there's a lot of other content over on Just Japan Stuff as well. As for myself, Kevin, hey, it's another week. I've got some interviews coming up on the weekend for the podcast. I got a couple lined up for the weekend for future episodes. I'm pretty excited about that. My weekend plans, I'm planning to get out there and doing a bit of hanami, some cherry blossom viewing and eating. That's right, eating some nice picnic food, if possible, if the weather permits. Of course, remember, like I mentioned earlier on in the episode, you can check me out over at the Anchor app on iPhone or Android. Check it out. Go to the iTunes store and search for Anchor. And of course, like I mentioned, that's kind of like the anchor you would drop from a boat. That's right. So you spell that ANCHOR. And Just Japan Bites is a new little show that'll be popping up mostly every day, just a minute or two, a quick little bite about Japan, something about Japan for you. So go over there and give me a star, favorite me, like me, use the app, follow me. It's a new fun little way to get out there and follow the Just Japan podcast in a little tiny way. I can make these little episodes just for my iPhone by talking to my phone. Just I hit a button and I talk. So a little bit less production value than with a Just Japan podcast episode, just a little bit, but it's a fun thing to do. And I think if you guys are into Japan and you're into this podcast, you'll be into that too. So go check it out. Link will be in the show notes. As usual, as I always say, you can always find me on Twitter at JLandKev, on Facebook at Just Japan Stuff. You can always email the Just Japan podcast anytime you want with questions, comments, positive vibes, offers of bags of money, which probably won't happen. But you can always email me at justjapanpodcast@gmail.com. So folks, that's it. I can tell you that I'm really happy that you guys are listening to the podcast. Coming off a banner month, great things happening. I'm excited. I'm excited to make the show. I'm excited that I've got like four interviews lined up in the next week, which is really cool. I'm excited about that. Some good stuff. Really diverse topics too. So that'll be a lot of fun. All right, guys. Well, that does it for another episode of the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan. My name's Kevin O'Shea. I'm a Canuck. I'm a Canadian. I live in Kobe, Japan. And each and every week I bring to you a podcast about Japan. And I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to download and listen. You folks out there in Just Japan podcast land are amazing. And if you want to get in contact with me at any time, the best way to do it, of course, is over on the Facebook page. I live on that page. I interact on that page throughout the day and night. And that's, of course, facebook.com/justjapanstuff. And on Twitter at JLandKev. I'm pretty active over there as well, so you can normally find me there. Or shoot me an email at justjapanpodcast@gmail.com. All right, guys. Well, that does it for another episode of the podcast. Wherever you are in the world, hope you're happy. Hope you're healthy. And I'll be talking to you real soon.
Bye.